Welcome, everyone. My name is Jimmy Chan, and I help our customers deploy enterprise-grade voice agents in production. That's all I do. And today, we're going to share our framework for discovering winning voice AI use cases, the ones with the highest ROI. And by the end of this session, you'll have a proven framework for identifying, scoping, and prioritizing some of the best AI opportunities in voice. And this is the same framework that we use to help our customers hit million call minutes a day. So let's start with what you're going to walk away with. So first is we're going to walk through our discovery framework. This is our customer journey to hotspot to use case methodology. And this is the core mental model of what this is about. The second is our scoring model. How do you evaluate opportunities using a simple feasibility and impact criteria? Then our priority matrix, which helps turn those scores and translates those into P1 through P4 classifications. P stands for priority. And then finally, we're going to walk through our concept of the agent blueprint, which is the V1 definition of your voice AI agent for your P1 use case. So I'm going to start with the core mental model. And the way to think about this is like a highway system, right? So this takes you from point A to point B. And the journey or the customer journey is the entire highway. It's all the roads, the interchanges, the whole network. And a hotspot is where there are traffic jams. This is where cars start to slow down. This is where the problems concentrate heavily. And the use case is a specific repair that you might do. For example, you might add a lane, you might fix a road, you might add some signage, or you might add traffic lights. And so the point here is that you don't start by randomly repaving a road. You want to study the patterns first. You want to find where the jams are and then decide what's best to fix. And the same thing happens in voice AI. So you map the customer journey, you find out where the calls and the frictions concentrate, and then you scope the right automation. So to discover voice AI use cases, you basically work through these three levels of abstraction. The first one is the end-to-end journey. It's a whole map. In healthcare, for example, this could be everything from patient outreach to ongoing support. Hotspots, so one level down, that's where the pain concentrates within the journey. Where does the volume pile up? Where do operators get frustrated? By operators, I mean the human operators. Where are customers struggling to get set up? And where are support calls piling in, for example? And the use case is a little bit lower in that hierarchy. It's the specific automation that we can build. So for example, in scheduling appointments, handling inbound calls to book times to increase MRI or medical equipment utilization is one of those. An example here to illustrate. So a customer journey, it might be the full end-to-end journey of ongoing patient care. This is in healthcare. One of the hotspots where pain lives is in scheduling. But a hotspot does not equal a use case. And this is one of the most common mistakes we see. Scheduling is really broad. And if you try to build scheduling that handles everything, it will most likely fail. And so you have to break down the hotspot down into specific automatable tasks. Here is where you want to decompose the hotspot into specific use cases like scheduling an appointment, canceling the appointment, confirming the appointment, or sending an appointment reminder the day before. So that's sort of the high level, the core mental model. Now, how do you find hotspots? Hotspots tend to reveal themselves when there are three different signals, or basically when these three signals converge. You need high volume, so high call frequency, repetitive patterns, predictable triggers. And if you're doing the same thing hundreds of times a month, that's a pretty good signal. Pain is basically very long handle times, operator frustration, compliance risks, errors. If people complain about it and if it causes problems, that's also probably a signal. And fit is something that people miss a lot too. Is this actually suitable for automation? So do you have structured flows? Do you have very clear outcomes? Do we have data available via APIs? Not everything that's painful can be automated yet. And then when all of these three things converge, you have volume, you have pain, you have fit, then you found a hotspot that's worth looking into, that's worth investigating. Once you have hotspots, you're going to want to break them down into specific tasks or automations that can alleviate the hotspot. And then you can score those use cases. The way we evaluate opportunities is roughly in two dimensions. You want to look at feasibility and impact. On the feasibility, what we're trying to do is, can we build it? So that's the question we're trying to answer. So this is based on API maturity of your customers, on complexity of the workflow, and on the risk posed by automating certain workflows. And impact answers the question of, is this worth building in the first place? This is based on volume, this is based on cost savings, this is based on the strategic value that the automation will add to your company or to your function. And so these two dimensions together determine the priority for that use case. So if you have something that's high feasibility and high impact, well, that's going to be your P1. If it's low on both, then that's a P4, and you probably want to avoid those use cases. I'm going to break down each of these dimensions in more detail. And first, I'm going to start with feasibility. So feasibility has roughly three factors, and you can score them simply between 1 to 5. You can do 1 to 10. I just like to keep it simple here. And what you'll realize as you look at this table and fill this up with your customers is that these questions will naturally be things that you'll be asking customers to gather information to determine whether that use case is worth automating as you fill out this table for yourself. So that's a great exercise. So what do we mean by API maturity? We mean, do your customers have production APIs that are well documented? If they do, then you can score high on them, give them a 5. If there's no APIs and everything is manual, then you might want to score 1. For voice AI deployments, customers who don't have APIs to the systems that their voice agents interact with, I would say that's a red flag because they either need to build them or you have to build it for them. But it adds timeline risk and on that deployment. For example, if integrating a voice agent system to your customer who has a very legacy ERP system, and the only way to interact with that system is via very advanced computer use, then it's going to be more difficult to get in there and have your voice agent trigger actions on your customer systems of records. So something to keep in mind. The second thing is complexity. Are the flows linear? Are they structured? If they are, you can score 5. If it requires a lot of judgments, a lot of exceptions to the flow, then you're probably going to score it low. Risk is the third area. And this is where you want to look at something that's low stake, something that's reversible, and what happens if something goes wrong, basically. If something goes wrong and you can just quickly fix it or stop something, then that's low risk. So you can score high in this matrix. But if it's high stakes, it's highly regulated, and you absolutely can't afford mistakes, then it's a very risky project or automation. And so you want to score low in our scoring system. And so what you can do is you can take the score for these three components, and then you can average them out. And if you get a score of 4+, then that's great. Below 3, you might start to struggle. Anything below that, it will be really, really hard as a place to get started. Now, onto impact. Impact has also 3 key factors. The first one is volume. Do we have thousands of calls per month or hundreds of calls per month? If there's a lot of calls, then you score high in volume. If it's low, you score low. Now, something to keep in mind with volumes is that it tends to be very relative to your customer and to your company. If you're selling to a very large enterprise and they have thousands of calls per month, maybe that's not high volume for that use case for that company. But if you're selling to like an SMB, then maybe it is. And so something to keep in mind as well that how you score these is also relative to you and to your customer. The second thing you might want to look at is cost savings. Like, can you cut handling time by a certain percent? If you can, then that's great. If you can't, then that's not as good. And the last one is strategic value, which is probably the most important. Here, you want to look at what's a core differentiator for that customer. And if the voice agent and the automations are highly, it's part of the core for that company, very strategic, then it's high strategic value. Something that's important to know, obviously, is that impact is what ultimately drives that business case. And if you have high impact, it means that you're going to have executive buy-in that's a bit easier to get, and you'll get a deal that's faster to close. And so that's really important to know. Let's see how feasibility and impact combine into priorities. So once you have all these scores for the use cases, you're going to want to place them in this matrix. And what you see in this matrix is P1 through P4, which is a priority matrix. And P1 is your flagship use cases. These are highly feasible, high impact. This is where you want to start. And this is a quick way to prove value. It's lower risk relatively, and it's a big payoff. And so here's where you always want to land first. The second, P2, are what we call strategic bets. These are high impact, but lower feasibility. And these are valuable, but they're a little harder to get. And so you tackle them after you've proved that you can do P1. P3 are what we call quick wins or training wheels or training ground. This one is very interesting. This is high feasibility, but lower impact. Our use cases are easy to build, but they're limited in the value that they could provide. And so this typically is what we recommend for building confidence, building trust, filling current gaps, but not the kinds of use cases that you want to lead with. So now there are customers who are a bit more wary of deploying AI systems. So maybe they have a budget, they want to do something, but they're really nervous about AI because they haven't really built with them. They don't have the expertise in-house. And so in some cases, it might make sense to do a very short pilot that is sort of a quick win type of pilot, but with the idea of eventually moving to a P1 flagship use case with high feasibility and high impact. And so you populate this, and then you have ranked priority for your use cases. And later in today's webinar, I'm going to walk through an example of how we do this basically step by step. So right now, I'm just covering sort of the conceptual part of the framework, but we're going to get more practical. So once you've had your use cases, P1 through P4, all ranked and stacked, what you're going to do is you're going to take the first use case that you want to automate, and then you're going to create your V1 agent blueprint. And this is, I think, the most important part, because once you've done this, you're going to walk out of that meeting with your customer, or even just for yourself, with a very clear definition of what that first voice agent use case is going to look like, what it's going to do, what it's not going to do, and how are you going to measure success for it. It's a high-level template. It's not meant to be exactly all of the details and the integrations for your agent. And that's why we call it a blueprint. It's a high level. It's a device to start moving teams forward, to get buy-in, to start that pilot, to do that proof of concept. And a blueprint consists of a use case, the one that you've selected as your top priority, a set of owners, and it helps you define the agent capability at a very high level. It also defines that business outcome, key metrics, and what that deployment strategy is going to be. Let's see how this whole process now looks like with a real example. And the example I've chosen here is healthcare. This is top of mind for us, and in general, we hear a lot of customers working through these. And the example is the patient journey that we're going to go through here. And this applies to, for example, clinics, health systems, or multi-location practices. So, and the scenario here is, let's say you have a multi-location healthcare provider, and they provide, they have like high patient volume. Their front desk staff, they're overwhelmed. They're constantly fielding calls, intake calls, scheduling calls, admin questions, and then patients complain about hold times, and the staff is just burning out, right? So in this customer scenario, there's going to be multiple journeys. And a way that they might look like after you've mapped them could be something like this. So 4 key end-to-end customer journeys. So this is the highest level of abstraction. Again, this is sort of the highway, right? So you have patient acquisition, and this is how patients find and enroll with the healthcare provider. And that journey may include a marketing outreach, an initial contact to that patient, and then enrollment. And then on the patient onboarding side, it's just a different journey. And that could include getting a patient fully set up, basically verifying their identity, collecting records from previous providers, insurance verification, and then booking that first appointment. A third journey in healthcare could be ongoing care, right? You have patients, clients, basically, and this is sort of their day-to-day interactions, right? You might do scheduling, you might do check-ins, referrals, they might have billing questions, and this typically is where a lot of the call volume is going to live. And then the last journey could be re-engagement. So this is bringing back patients who maybe have lapsed. So this could include outreach, re-enrollment, and getting them back on a care plan. And then notice that these are end-to-end journeys. They're not just phone call types. And then that context matters a lot for how you prioritize. Now, one caveat here is it's also very important to figure out what journeys you're going to exclude. So those are basically the journeys that you will explicitly not cover. And you want to set that expectation for your customers. When we work with clients, we typically discourage them from starting workflows in certain journeys. So if it's in healthcare, for example, we are most likely not going to start with delivering clinical care. So this is like the core clinical work that requires medical judgment or any sort of like emergency or urgent triage or life critical decisions. In these cases, usually you want to escalate or tell the customer, if this is an emergency, hang up, call 911. And the reason is because there's too much variability and there's too much risk. It doesn't mean you can't do these use cases. It just means you don't start with these ones. Now that you've identified some of these customer journeys, let's find some hotspots. So within those 4 journeys, you can identify hotspot, as I mentioned, by looking at the volume, pain, and automation fit. So let's say for the initial outreach in the patient acquisition journey, you might have high volume, high pain, and high fit. And these are because they're scripted outbound calls. You're leaving a voicemail. They're one directional. They're very predictable. There's no clinical content. So as you go through this exercise for your customer specifically, it might be, high, medium, and high. And so that's the score you get. And then for the first contact intake and patient onboarding, you might have high volume, high pain, high fit. And because every new patient will touch this step in the process, it's also very highly structured. You can verify the identity. You can understand why they're calling. You can route them appropriately. And it can be rules-based and no clinical decisions. So that's also pretty interesting. You might have records collection, and this is also part of patient onboarding. You might have high volumes, extremely high pain, maybe medium fit. This is because you might have to call an external organization, let's say, for example, other doctors' offices, other hospitals to gather records. And in some cases, you might not be able to control those systems. They might have a variable IVR that you have to navigate through. They might have an inconsistent process that might vary from vendor to vendor. And you might have some other HIPAA related complications. So the pain is real, but the fit might be tricky depending on who you have to navigate on the external world. And then the last one could be access and scheduling in ongoing care. So this could be high volume, high pain, and typically high fit, and possibly the biggest opportunity. Highest call volume. In some cases, they will have well-defined EHR APIs. Not always the case, but at least for their scheduling systems, they will. And maybe low clinical risk. And so here you're trying to book, reschedule, cancel appointments. And like with journeys, you would also want to think about some hotspots that you might specifically want to exclude, right? And so, for example, maybe you don't want to start with billing disputes within ongoing care, right? Like, because patients might be very angry when they call in. It might require quite a bit of judgment and figure out what adjustments you can offer. It involves some heavy or difficult negotiation, maybe some de-escalation. And each situation is unique. And so there might not be a standard script. And so that's something to watch out for. In sometimes prior authorization can be difficult, like getting insurance approval for certain treatments. This can be tricky if not scoped correctly. We have customers who have done this successfully, of course, but there's a lot of variation, and you want to be able to, again, scope down as much as possible. And the reason is because payer requirements can vary a lot. There's no standard. And then it often requires some clinical justification and appeals, right? And so this makes the process a little bit more complex. And you also need staff that can navigate this. Now, say that you've identified all these hotspots and identify specific automations that you want to take, you can then move to scoring those use cases, right? And so you want to, again, look at it from a feasibility and impact perspective. And remember that feasibility has different factors and impact also has different factors to consider. So, for example, in appointment scheduling, it might be high feasibility and high impact. And so that would make it a clear P1. Let's say that you have a scheduling API for your customer and they're pretty mature, they're well documented, you're able to read through them and try to help integrate, or they've already integrated. And so then the conversation within those voice agents could be fairly low branching, low clinical risk, and this is the highest volume call type. And so this is somewhere where we've seen a lot of customers start and have a lot of success. A second use case might be in the sort of authenticating, verifying intents, and then triaging those inbound calls. This could also be high, and that will make it a P1 priority use case. The reason is because this typically is the front door to every inbound call. And it can be structured, it can be rule-based routing, no clinical decisions, and it pairs very nicely with appointment scheduling, which was sort of the first use case. And then there's like two more that could come out of that exercise. The other one is outbound voicemails for signing up. So this is high feasibility, maybe medium impact. So you put that as a P2. It's mostly one directional, not a lot of branching, no sensitive data, but maybe this is just sort of top of funnel with very indirect conversion. And so, impact to revenue or impact to utilization might not be as high. And so this is good to have, but maybe not where you start. And the last one I have here is medical record request. Here's an interesting one. I would say, let's say medium visibility and high impact, of course. So that would be like a P2. The pain here is enormous. So this is 100%, it's validated pain. And staff really hate to do this task. But you're calling these external environments that you don't necessarily control. You have IVRs to navigate. HIPAA process might be inconsistent across providers. Maybe there's no API contract with these providers. And so until that changes, this could still stay at a P2 instead of a P1. And depending on how you scope it and how mature the ecosystem is, it could move up, or you could tackle it after you've run out of P1s. So a lot of it comes down to how you scope those use cases. And in the blueprint that I'm going to show you, there's a bit more detail on how to do that. All right. Now, let's say that you and your customer agree that P1 is what you want to do and that P1 is your appointment scheduling. And that's the way to go. Now, how do you put together the sort of V1 agent blueprint? So that's what I'm going to cover next. So the agent blueprint is, think of it as, it's essentially a one-pager or two-pager, but very short document. Think of it as a sort of like a product requirements document, if you're coming from a product world, but for voice agents and voice agent automation. So it's essentially a form that you fill out with your customer. You can also fill it out for yourself with input from your customer. In any case, it's a collaboration where you have a high-level idea for what information you need. You work with your customer, or you directionally try to estimate it to be able to put together this sort of blueprints. And this blueprint can be used as a way to kind of move the conversation forward. It can be part of your pilot, and later down the road, once you have completed sort of that V1 agent, you can start scaling it up and then moving down to the rest of the use cases. So basically, you'll start with a high-level overview of the use case that you selected and who owns it. And you probably need to have a few stakeholders involved in this process from your customer side. You might want to have a product manager or someone in the sort of ops or customer experience side. So basically the domain that you're working to automate parts of. And then typically you need like an engineer platform lead to start. Even if you are providing some of the integration and sort of the forward deployed engineering service, you need a counterpart on the customer side to be able to help you understand their APIs, their integration, their documentation, and their systems architecture. And so the next thing you want to do is really important, is to define your agent's capability at a high level. So you want to start with the main supported intent for V1 only. At this stage, there is no need to be too ambitious just yet. In our scheduling example, we might start with just booking new appointments, or it could be a little bit, you can incorporate multiple use cases. So booking a new appointment, also rescheduling, and also confirming the upcoming ones. And it's extremely important to explicitly state unsupported intents as well in this phase. This doesn't mean that you're not going to do it now or ever. It just means that you're just not doing it as the first thing. So this seems like a small thing, but we found that it helps anchor the right expectations with your customers. It keeps everybody honest. And in this example, we say that our supported intents are urgent care or same-day sick visits, or referral scheduling and insurance verification, which we can save for later. The reason why it's important to do this is a lot of customers have expectations, maybe incorrect expectations of what AI can do. And so when you pitch, we can automate things with AI. They'll think, it's magic, and it can do everything. And when you don't define what specifically it's going to do and explicitly what it's not going to do, the chances that there's that misalignment, that there's mismatch expectations is way higher. And it's just harder to build trust, harder to prove ROI, exactly because you're taking on too much at once. Okay, so you have your support intents, your explicitly unsupported intents, and then you want to describe if there's any guardrails that you want to build in. You want to define what the escalation rules are going to be. What are those paths? At which points do you transfer to a human operator? And the guardrails are here to possibly prompt your voice AI agent to never give medical advice, for example. That would be a guardrail example. You want to define channels and coverage too. Clients are typically very eager to just turn it on everywhere all at once. And that's possible, but it's not super practical early on. You want to start with maybe just phone calls and not, for example, not web calls, just phone calls. And you might want to do it in English only. And then you want to focus on business hours for now, or maybe just after hours. And then you want to make sure that you have a human operator as a backup to handle any issues or some of the escalation, especially when you start rolling this out. Once you have the basic agent capability defined, you want to move on to sort of like the business outcomes and measuring success. Here you want to be very, very clear about what the goal is, right? So like, what's the primary outcome you want to achieve with your agent? Is it about increasing revenue? Is it about efficiency or reducing costs? For example, efficiency could be helping increase utilization of very expensive medical equipment for your customer. Or is it purely about improving the customer experience due to very long hold times and it makes your customers or your patients really upset? And so you want to define that clearly. You want to know what that is. Typically, we see use cases where you can help increase revenue as the best use cases because there's way more urgency, super aligned with what your customers need, and it will just help you move faster. Now, some of the revenue generating use cases are relatively easier and some are relatively more complicated. So, like the relatively easier ones is you could think of appointment scheduling as a revenue generation engine, because let's say you have underutilized equipment and now you're going to fill it up and you can increase revenue. And so in that case, it might be relatively easy, but there might be cases where you're having voice agents call out to make sales. So that could increase revenue too. But those are more complex use cases. We've seen it done with our customers, but they do require more work. Next, you want to define success metrics. It's super important that you do this. How do you know that this is all working for you? For appointment scheduling, maybe that's appointment completion rate with like NPS 4 out of 5. And it's absolutely important, and we see this being missed a lot, is not having a baseline with what current humans can do, right? So you don't know what you're up against, especially if you are automating some of those use cases that are currently done by human operators. The reason why baselines are important is because they help you calculate the ROI that you will deliver to your customers at the end of the day. When your customer is at the end of the pilot and they ask the question, did we sign the contract, yes or no? It's going to come down to what's the ROI that you've helped achieve, right? If you helped increase revenue, that's great. They'll love it. That's obviously not the only way to create ROI. Reducing costs is another way to create ROI. And so all these ways, increasing revenue, reducing costs, improving the customer experience, they're all ways. But you need to know what the baseline is so you can actually calculate it. Like if currently human operators resolve, let's say at 90% for this use case specifically, which is appointment booking, and their average handle time is 6 minutes, maybe there's a high no-show rate. Maybe that's sort of like current baseline. Then, very important, you want to define what the V1 agent success threshold is going to be. So let's say you start with agent completion at greater than 55% with like a CSAT of a 4 out of 5, but maybe your average handle time is less than 3 minutes. So in and out very quick. You can also optionally, but highly recommend it, you can set up a secondary metric. This is usually a way to balance and prevent any sort of like incorrect optimization that is quite common. And so for example, you want to track the no-show rates, for example. So when you summarize the ROI, it's not like you're just optimizing to like book appointments, but like nobody shows up. So like that would be a really great ROI for your customer. So these are important things to consider. You want to think about what your deployment strategy is going to be. So I like to think of this in at least 3 stages, and each with an increasing amount of capability for your voice agent. This is where you go from that sort of tiny V1 to something that can add more and more value to your customer as you prove that you can do it, as you build trust with your champions. And so let's say that you might want to start with just new appointments for existing patients only. And then once you hit a certain metric, which you can define and agree with your customer, you can then move on to stage 2 and so on. And so, for example, you could add rescheduling or cancellation and new patients, for example. And then finally, you can expand to like all locations. And this could include a new use case, which is to also send out appointment reminders. And so this way, you're always showing value at each step. You're very confidently rolling out capability, and it's additive. And you're building trust with your clients while you create more and more value over time if you can confidently deliver that. And the metrics will be very transparent to your clients, to your customers, and then you both win. And so this is why this is super important. Now, finally, this is something that InfoSec and IT teams will love. And if you are trying to sell in the enterprise, you will encounter this very often. You would want to have this section of the blueprint filled out too. You want to get these teams involved early because IT and InfoSec tend to be the 2 veto superpowers. So they can like turn down, like even if you come in with an amazing use case, an agent that sounds and works great, these 2 teams might say no. And then that's a very tough decision. So what you want to do is you want to identify risk early as possible. Like what happens if you double book an appointment? What happens if you got the wrong patient map? You basically want to describe and write down what those paths are going to be and what they're going to look like so you can anticipate some of the problems and document them. You want to understand what prerequisites or preconditions need to be met. For example, do you have APIs to the systems of records? Do you have all the escalation paths well defined? Do you have your HIPAA compliance set up? Do you have your BAA signed? So these are very healthcare specific, but every industry has their certifications or compliance requirements. Like, it might be like a SOC 2 thing, but in healthcare, it's typically HIPAA, BAA, high trust. Then you want to also leave some open questions to get team input on. Like, do you disclose that this is an AI upfront? So, like, how do you handle elderly patients, for example? Do you allow provider references? And this is just a nice discussion. What I'll say on the do you disclose the AI or not? There are two ways to think about it. The first one is more of like a branding approach. Sometimes, if your company or your customers' branding is around trust and transparency, then maybe in this branding policy, you want to disclose that you're using AI upfront. And the second is more of like a legal and compliance side. It just may be the case that you have to disclose whether you're using an AI or not. And it's not about branding; it's just more about compliance. So work with your customers to figure out like if there are any requirements around these, and then you can have this discussion internally and then document the process, because this will affect how you design that agent experience. Yeah. So the idea here is that you want to basically very upfront design all these flows, and you want to think through this end to end with your customer together. And the outcome at the end of this should be a very clearly defined V1. So you have a blueprint for what that V1 first agent use case, highest priority with high impact, high feasibility, and then you're on to execute. Now, as you deliver on the first use case, you already have a list of priorities of all the other use cases. So you'll pilot this with your customer, you'll prove the ROI, and then you've shipped that. You've built trust, you've built confidence, you've proven the value. Now you can go back to the exercise that you already did, ideally with your customer, and say, look, we worked on P1. Now we have another use case in P1. Would you want to start a new pilot for that? Or would you want to move into that one? And so in a way, as you do this exercise, you're not only identifying, helping your customer map their business and where are the opportunities to automate, you're helping them with a framework for how to think about not just building and automating the first use case, but also how do you expand that first use case into more and more capability? And then after that, how do you expand that into more and more use cases until you cover more use cases, more hotspots, and more parts of that customer journey? And so that's what I have for you in terms of the framework. I've got a couple events coming up, and I just want to mention this before I get into the Q&A actually. So first is Vapi will be hosting a live in-person workshops where we take that use case and that blueprint that we've identified, and then we start basically building out what are the prompt designs, what are the conversation design, what are the tools that we need to build integrations for, what are the guardrails into more detail. So it's like taking the blueprint, what's the test strategy, how do you make sure that this is enterprise grade quality, how do you launch this? And so we're going to be sending out more information on these to your inbox for everyone who was attended today. And so expect this coming in your email. And the second thing, which we do have a date for, is we have a webinar similar to this in March 17th. And this is going to be at the same time as today. So 1 p.m. Eastern time and 10 a.m. Pacific time. And so our product team, this led by Nick Robin, he's going to talk about how to build voice agents from scratch using our new product called Composer. So this is sort of a vibe coding, a sort of agentic building approach to building voice AI assistants. And this is built right into the Vapi product, the Vapi dashboard, and you can scan that QR code, right, that's showing my screen if you want to attend. So it'll be a similar workshop to this. It'll be hosted on Zoom, March 17th. And we're going to show you how this product works. So you can come in, see how you can quickly build B1 agents. You could possibly take that blueprint and basically vibe code your first version. So this is very important to build, design, use the framework to design and write the requirements for that voice agent. Now, okay, I'm going to do a Q&A. We have maybe about 15 minutes left. And so I would love to see if there's any questions I could answer, and just let me know. Feel free to type questions in the chat. And I know Velson might come on and help answer some of those questions. I'll answer as many questions as possible around the framework, identifying use cases, seeing hotspots, what are good use cases to start with, which ones are not, why. Maybe we can get a little bit more into also like systems design, a bit about Vapi product. If I'm not able to answer all the questions, we can also do that following up on the webinar. And we also have a Discord channel there. So, okay, I'm going to just switch here for questions. Felson, do we have anything that I should answer here?
Yeah, we have a pretty popular question about how to provide good guardrails for the agent. I think it'd be great to answer this one live for everyone.
Yeah. So how to provide good guardrails. It all comes down to design, right? So first you want to identify what are the things that you need to guardrail against, right? And it changes by industry, by use case. And so there's two parts. One is you work with your customers to define what are the things that they're most concerned about. For example, for every tool call that you make into a systems of record, you would expect that sometimes they will return the wrong or incorrect information, right? So you can anticipate from the design that this is going to happen. So looking at just all the tool calls that you have to make, that's one opportunity. That's one thing. Second is branding. Customers have a brand that they deeply care about, and they have things that that your agent can or cannot say. And so you want to incorporate all of that in the process. You have compliance and security. You also should talk to IT or InfoSec to understand what are other cases that they don't want to address. Now, most of the guardrailing work happens around the prompt engineering and the tool calling part of the voice agent building. And so really it comes down to knowing like a list of the things that the business cares about and then defining what those are and then translating those into the prompt for your voice agent and then also how it's going to respond based on what tool calls it gets around those. And so for guardrails, that's one big aspect in the design. The second big aspect is in the testing. It is not practically possible to basically figure out all the things that you have to guardrail against. So the best way to do this is to come up with a set of tests and evaluations that help you catch additional things that you might have missed, right? So, and there's two kinds of tests that you can do. One is very sort of like very specific tests, like you know that the agent must never give medical advice, for example. That's a guardrail. So you can write a hard test against that. But sometimes you may not be able to anticipate all of the things that you want to look for. So then what you want to do is to do a bit more of exploratory testing or simulations testing or agent to agent testing, where basically you spin up an agent to be able to cover way more variability in what could possibly go wrong. And then basically battle test your agent against it and then see what the results are. And then from the results, you might see new things that you need to guardrail against. So you add those back into the design, which was the first part. So that's how I would handle the guardrailing. It's a bit of an art. Like when you build software, you can write a bunch of unit tests and then you can deterministically cover like the universe of things that need to be checked against. But in voice agents, which is a non-deterministic system, you have to design heavily for it based on what your customer needs are. And then you have to test heavily for it as well. Yeah. Belton, you still there?
Yep, great. Another question that we have is what are the key pieces of information to ask to your customers to build an agent? For example, FAQs, about us, qualifying questions.
Yeah. So the question is basically what questions to ask your customers to define what they want to do. Right. So first, you identify what that use case is. So when you identify the use case or the journey or the hotspot, you kind of like already have some idea for the kind of thing that they're trying to accomplish. Right. So I would focus a lot on the information in sort of the agent blueprint. You do want to know, you want to scope it down. You want to scope it down to what is it going to do? What is it not going to do? And you have to ask the customer, can we access your APIs? Like what APIs you have? So for example, if you want to do scheduling or if you want to do customer support, well, we have to be able to access your scheduling system for scheduling. And then for support, you might want to be able to access the CRM and you might want to be able to access sort of their ticketing system. So that way, when somebody submits a support request or calls for support, you can identify that customer, pull up information about them, and then be able to actually help them. And so if it is a support use case, absolutely, you do want FAQs. You want, basically, they might already have help desk. So you can ingest all of that information as a knowledge base for your agent to pull and retrieve data from to answer questions accurately. And so it varies case by case, but I would say look at that use case, figure out just a narrow set of things that it must do. Think about what it's not going to do at the V1 stage. and then figure out how do you create a great experience for it, right? Like what are the kinds of questions that the customers might ask you for, and then what information you have to be able to supply answers to that question.
And another question that we have really is around how to manage multiple organizations. So say you're building on Vapi to resell to other
Yeah.
clients and customers. How should you go about structuring that and organizing it?
Yeah, so that's maybe not so much of a framework or how to identify use case question, but more implementation. So some of the patterns that we've seen work with our customers is basically they will create a separate org, a separate Vapi org per customer on the other side. So that's one pattern we've seen. So one org per customer. That way, all the billing, all the agents, basically your assistants and your squads and the tools, everything is sort of isolated on a per customer basis. I guess the downside of that approach is that you do have to write some extra code to then manage it in your system. So you need to have sort of a table or a lookup table of some sort within your backend to track which org ID with which API key for which customer. So you do have to create a bit of like an internal mapping and reference system to keep track of it. The other approach that we've seen customers do is just to manage everything in one Vapi org. And then they end up using a lot of sort of transient assistance with structure outputs to then be able to capture to first to manage definitions for agents for different end customers. And then they use structure outputs to be able to capture information after each call has happened and then log those against that particular customer. So this is how I've seen the patterns work. I think something here that we could do, if it's like something that a lot of people are looking for, is to send feedback to our product team internally about that as a possible use case. Because I could imagine sort of like a sub account management system where we could like build an API to basically with one sort of master Vapi API key be able to using the API to create orgs with billing, but then still manage everything in one place. Not promising anything. It's just something that we would have to see what the demand is for, scope out, and then kind of like make it part of our really big product roadmap.
Yeah, another big question is about multilingual use cases. So when to go from using a multilingual agent to a multilingual squad, what are the different options there and how someone could go about building and QAing a multilingual use case?
Yeah. So Vapi's platform, Vapi's architecture is that of highly composable units of feature that can be put together to address different use cases. And so that's a good thing and it's a bad thing. And so the good thing is that yeah, you can do multilingual use cases in 10 different ways. And then maybe the downside of that is that choosing the right way is less opinionated in the Vapi system, at least for now. And so that makes it a little bit harder on the builder, which is, I assume, the audience, to figure out what's like the set of best practices that you can do. So for multilingual use cases, I would say in the US, a lot of multilingual happens to be just English and Spanish. And most of the transcribers and the voices, right, they're fairly good in addressing these two languages and switching between those two. DLMs tend to typically work for most languages, so that's why I'm just mostly focusing on the transcribe and on the voice side. Now, we have customers in Europe for which this is a little bit more complicated because in Europe it's not just English and Spanish. It could be many, many more languages, and even within the same country, there could be multiple languages as well. And it turns out that a lot of the sort of the frontier model work in transcription and voices tend to happen in sort of like the most popular languages. So you will see a difference in sort of like performance and how multilingual works. What we find very helpful for less popular languages than English is basically there's different models that perform well for different languages. And so if the surface area of the languages is small, like 1 to 2 languages, it's usually fine to just have a transcription model and a voice model that can switch between. But if it's more complicated, you're covering 3, 4, or 5 languages, and each one has its very unique set of constraints, then it might be more of a better pattern to basically, when the customers call in, for example, to basically get them to qualify in one of the languages. And then you basically use like a multi-agent system to basically swap out the underlying configuration to handle that very nicely. And so that's what I'll recommend. And, we could go into way more detail here, but there's just a lot of possible ways So there's no one way. And the only way to know is to run benchmark and test it for the languages that you're trying to target and for the combination of languages that you're trying to target. We maybe have time for maybe one or two more questions, depending on how long I take to answer each. Let's
Yeah.
find one more.
Another good question would be how to optimize for latency and what are the different ways, like the different levers that you can pull in an agent to help optimize that.
Yeah, latency, it's a very critical question. I recently called a voice agent for a satellite internet company and found that it to be very slow. And it kind of broke the immersion for me. So there's a few things that affect latency. First layer is Vapi already does a lot of underlying work to get you the best latency possible, right? So aside from that, okay, how we look at the things that you can actually do. So what makes latency? Latency is how fast the model responds, how big your prompt is. Those are the two biggest factors in latency. And the other one is like maybe like distance to servers, but let's just say for now, we're not gonna consider that. So basically for model is pick the smallest, cheapest model you can that can perform your use case at an acceptable threshold. So for example, if the use case is, let's say, like a simple triaging use case, then you don't really need a lot of intelligence in the model to be able to handle that, right? But if your use case is maybe trying to sell to a very sophisticated buyer and you have to do negotiation or convincing, then you might want to have like a slightly smarter model for that use case or the target that you're trying to hit. Let's say you're trying to hit 80%. And so basically, I would always pick the smallest possible model that hits my target for that use case. So that's the first thing. The second thing is a lot of work around prompt engineering and context engineering. It's so important, right? You could write a very, very long prompt that does the same things as a very small prompt. And so you want to experiment with ways to simplify the prompt as much as possible. One of the key things that adds a lot of prompt tokens is when you make tools calls. If you don't optimize the tool calls, and let's say, for example, that you're doing an appointment scheduling and you hit your endpoint and you say, okay, get available appointments, and then you return all the available appointments for the whole month. Like, think about how many tokens that's going to be. Think about like that JSON payload that's going to come back with a lot of information that you don't need. That's all coming back to your message history in your agent. So it makes every turn longer and longer and longer. So there's a lot of ways you can try to optimize the prompt, right? You can make it smaller. You can make sure that when you inject tool results or or context, that you keep it really minimal, yet still getting the performance, right? And again, with all of this, you have to run tests. Like you have to know what you're getting. You have to be able to measure and benchmark whether you're hitting that target that you've promised your customer with the smallest, fastest. Now, the last thing I'll say in terms of like latency is multi-agent systems do help a lot with latency because you can take a very long prompt for one agent and then break it down into logical units, logical groups, and then just have those individual sub-agents basically hand off to each other. So each one keeps a smaller context. And so you can improve the latency. And then, you can also look at better models, better voices or transcribers, something that's close to where your customers are. All right. Thanks, everyone. It's been great. Please, we have another one of these webinars next month. So join us, ask us questions. We're here to help you succeed in finding use cases, getting to your pilots, getting to your customers, but also on the product side, how to build your agents, how to make them work, how to get to production. Thank you all very much. Thank you and have a nice day.